Ukraine.
Talk, though, is easy, and action remains, one could argue, relatively limited. We'll talk to Libby in Westminster and Emma in Washington about how the thinking of the West is evolving and what might really be going on. Also, tonight, more chaos as the man appointed to champion LGBT rights resigns.
There comes a moment in public life where your principles are really important. And my principles are around LGBT inclusion.
The Met needs an outsider. Stephen Lawrence's brother on just how much has not changed in 30 years.
We never get the point where you go, they can close that. But then you've got a system that's been put in place to always be unbalanced.
Will it be Ukraine, cost of living or Partygate? Carl tries to take the temperature of voters in advance of local elections. And dancing together, the Ukrainian and the Russian ask the world to stand with Ukraine. Good evening. For years after they stained the conscience of the world, Western officials agonized about the massacres of the 1990s in places like Srebrenica and Rwanda, and swore that such depravity must never again be allowed license. But today we watch on as Russia's army visits its barbarism on the citizens of Ukraine. The scenes we have witnessed and the accounts we have heard are once again unspeakable, and many will find them hard to see and hard to hear. The rape of women and girls, the deaths of children, a man bound, beaten, gagged and shot in the head, bodies killed by the shelling of civilian targets left to rot where they lie in the streets. What our teams are witnessing for themselves on the ground entirely bears out the angry and the impassioned address given to the United Nations today by Ukraine's President Zelensky himself, which was simply shattering in its detail. Mothers, he said, had had their tongues cut out before they were raped in front of their children.
For Ivankiv, finally this was a day of salvation. Ukrainian army engineers had built a pontoon bridge reconnecting this small town with the outside world. The relief of those who'd endured 35 days of Russian occupation was obvious. But it's only when you hear what they've gone through that you can understand. Marina is the deputy mayor here and has heard grim accounts of how Russian soldiers treated women in the area.
Ось такий випадок, що в одному селі зґвалтували двох сестер, дівчина 15 і 16 років. Діти. Їх жінок витягували за волосся з погребів для того, щоб знущатись над ними. Дівчатка після цього обрізали собі волосся для того, щоб не бути гарними.
The town's physical damage is limited to a few streets, but it's what you can't see that's more devastating.
Штаны, как будто бы фарш перекручен и набили туда, насовали фарш.
Elena Skoropad is telling me about trying to save her son Artem. She scooped him into her arms after he was hit by shrapnel, describing the injuries in graphic detail. Artem was just 12 years old. A keen basketball player, his mother and stepfather Sasha had tried to flee, but they say a cluster munition exploded, peppering them with shrapnel.
Когда мы приехали сюда, Артем всю дорогу по дороге в машине кричал: «Мамочка, Саша, я вас люблю». Это его слова. Потом кричал, что ножки болят, спина. Мы когда сюда приехали, он еще живой был. Потом там несовместимые были травмы.
The hospital is full of those injured from the shooting, shelling and mines, but they're thankful there are now medical supplies. For more than a month, the doctors worked with almost nothing.
We worked without any electricity, without water, without anything, without any medicaments, no connection with the outside, with the world. And a lot of victims here from Russian attacks. Russians attacked civilians, they killed civilians, a lot of people with the gunshot wounds.
It's only today that people have managed to connect their phones to a temporary hotspot here, and suddenly they're able to talk to loved ones and find out who's still alive. Their faces tell a story of grief and shock at the scale of the war that until now has been hidden from them. There are many towns like Ivankiv which have been cut off from the outside world since the beginning of this war and occupied by the Russian army. Only now is the truth beginning to emerge about the horrors that have taken place. 20 miles to the south, the town of Borodyanka has been hollowed out by Russian missiles and artillery. Below the charred cliff faces of what were once apartment blocks, a police team has the grim task of recovering the remains of the inhabitants. In an ordinary residential street nearby, the detritus of the ill-disciplined army, which apparently forced its way into homes like this, marking the walls with their insignia. The front garden is littered with their ration packs and empty drink bottles. But it is in the back garden that the true depravity of their occupation becomes clear. It seems this man has not only been humiliated, but also horribly tortured. His head is bound in plastic.
Візуально ми бачимо, що людина зв'язана, руки зв'язані ззаді, і було якісь катування відносно вищевказаної особи. В зв'язку з тим, що голова замотана, тобі ж ми навіть візуально не можемо сказати причину смерті. Або це нанесення тілесних ушкоджень, які несумісні з життям, а людина просто не витримала катувань, або він застрелений.
The killing and destruction here appears to be wanton, designed to terrorize a population into submission. The bullet through the head of the statue of the Ukrainian hero and poet Taras Shevchenko is a symbol for the contempt with which the Russian soldiers held this country.
And Dan joins us now to talk about this. Dan, you and your team are helping the world to bear witness to this crime by crime, atrocity by atrocity, day by day. Could you just talk us through what you saw today and how you saw it?
Well, I think, there are towns like Ivankiv where the physical damage through much of the town is not that bad, but the psychological trauma that you uncover when you talk to almost anyone is really profound, and you don't have to go far to find awful stories of rape and execution. And then there are places like Borodyanka where the town has been pulverised by rockets and shells. There are, dozens, probably hundreds dead, and there also are signs of apparent execution and torture. And I think it's important to stress, we haven't been everywhere. We're getting more reports in all the time of other places that are as bad or even possibly worse that we will attempt to get to over the coming days. And also, this isn't just one rogue element of the Russian army operating in one town. This is far more widespread and systemic. And there is so much still to uncover, and so many people who will one day be held to account.
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed. Well, the plea for justice for the brutalised people of Ukraine delivered to the United Nations today by President Volodymyr Zelensky was angry and impassioned and deeply shocking, calling on the horror of what he himself has witnessed, and perhaps too the legacy of his own Jewish family's experience of the Holocaust. He accused Russia of the most terrible war crimes since the Second World War, calling for immediate Nuremberg-style tribunals to hold those responsible to account. He described in graphic detail the shooting, the raping, the torture and the killing of defenseless civilians by Vladimir Putin's forces. And in case his audience didn't get the message, he showed them equally graphic video evidence. It was a speech designed to jolt the watching world into action.
In a world haunted by the devastation of war, horrified by slaughter and inhumanity, the United Nations was tasked with maintaining peace and security.
Good morning, everyone. The 9,010th meeting of the Security Council is called to order.
9 decades on, its custodians are struggling to regain the peace amid further slaughter and inhumanity. The world has advanced enough that leaders can address them from afar,
I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of Ukraine.
But not enough for the savagery of war to be a thing of the past.
I am addressing you on behalf of the people who honor the memory of the deceased every single day, in the memory of the civilians who died, who were shot and killed in the back of their head after being tortured. Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into the wells, so they died there in suffering.
To reinforce his words, some of the worst images from Ukraine were played. So bad that we can't show many of them. It fell to the British ambassador to respond.
Would like to thank the delegation of Ukraine for sharing that video with us. The images are harrowing. Speaking in my national capacity, we are appalled by what we have seen and reiterate our solidarity with Ukraine.
The UN's lack of real power has been exposed once more, mainly because of Russia's presence and its power of veto of any resolution, a vote of death to some. From handwritten notes, the Russian ambassador rewrote the past and the present.
I simply would like to take advantage of the virtual presence here of the President of Ukraine and would like to address him directly. Now, we place on your conscience the ungrounded accusations against the Russian military, which are not confirmed by any eyewitnesses.
This chamber is far from the horrors it speaks of, but it does bear witness.
The meeting is adjourned.
For now, it seems bearing witness is all it's really able to do.
Well, let's get some analysis on what that is actually going to mean in practice in a moment. I'll speak to Libby in Westminster. But first, let's just go to Emma. Strong words, Emma, there from the Ukrainian president at the UN, even demanding Russia's removal, but presumably no chance of that happening.
No, very little chance indeed. Basically, President Zelensky said that the UN may as well dissolve itself so long as it had Russia on that council as a permanent member with the power of veto. He said it basically gave Russia the right to sow death. And there was no doubting just how frustrated President Zelensky was at what seems to be the inability of the UN to try and move this situation on in any way. When he asked for Russia to be removed, he must have known that it was almost impossible. Because of their power of veto, it means that Russia would have to basically say it was taking itself off the United Nations Committee, and there's absolutely no way it's going to do that. And indeed, even if it did that as some kind of publicity stunt, in reality it could be saved by China, another country with the power of veto and a close ally. But of course, for all we've heard about the lack of action by the United Nations, they are continually attempting to try and bring some peace in this situation, however difficult that is. And there has been great success by the UN in many countries over the years, but they have seen great failings too in Syria, the former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. And as long as Russia are there, it is likely they will have to add Ukraine to that sorry list.
Okay, Emma, thank you very much. Well, let's just put some of that to Libby. Look, I think a lot of people watching this, Libby, are thinking, well, could we be sending more arms and could we be imposing more sanctions? Let's maybe just deal with weapons first. What could we be sending? What are we sending? And what are we deliberately not sending?
Well, Tom, there's been no shortage of words of condemnation of the atrocities that we've seen in recent days in Ukraine. The Prime Minister tonight releasing a video that he'd recorded addressing the Russian people, sometimes speaking in Russian, saying that the massacres were a stain on the honor of Russia and saying its president was accused of war crimes. But are those very powerful words being matched by action? I have to say there isn't much sign of a shift in British policy. The requests by President Zelensky for us to send tanks and other armoured weapons. Well, I think there the British government has been quite reticent to say what its next steps will be. When the Prime Minister's spokesman was asked about this yesterday, he said nothing was being ruled out, but at the same time he said they were conscious of not wanting to do anything that would be seen to be escalatory. The Americans have been very, very circumspect about the idea of sending tanks to be used in Ukraine. And I think for the moment the British government shares that hesitancy.
Well, that brings us on to sanctions, particularly Russian energy. Is there any sign of movement on that?
Well, there was movement today. The EU, for the first time, announcing sanctions that included Russian energy, a ban on coal imports. But it's clear that the British government want them to go much further. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary in Poland, saying there needed to be a clear timetable for the elimination of imports of Russian energy, coal, gas and oil. Now, of course, Germany and Italy are much more dependent on those imports than Britain is, but I think we will be pushing at the G7 later this week for tougher and much more concrete action in this area. The EU did also announce a ban, for example, on Russian shipping today and also on some imports and some exports of machinery. But will any of this make a material difference on the ground? Will it give President Putin pause for thought? I think that's highly unlikely. And I think the danger for the West is, as you alluded to at the beginning, is that while the Prime Minister tonight was calling this a stain on the honour of Russia, if we stand by and do nothing, will it be seen as a stain on the West too?
OK, Libby, thank you very much indeed. Well, back home, and now to matters at home at least, and yet more embarrassment has been heaped on the government in the row over conversion therapy that seems to grow more furious by the day. The latest development has seen the resignation of the very person appointed by the government to champion the rights of LGBT plus people in the workplace. He spoke exclusively to Paul. Paul, he had some pretty tough things to say, did he not?
Yeah, Tom, because as you say, Ian Anderson was supposed to be the government's LGBT champion, but he feels he can no longer trumpet its policies. And this is all relating to the story we broke last Thursday about the Prime Minister planning to ditch this long-promised ban on so-called conversion therapy. The government did row back from that after absolute fury erupted following that story, and it decided to ban conversion therapy after all for gay and bisexual people, but not for trans people. And for many in the LGBT community, that is a real red line, particularly for Ian Anderson, which is what prompted today his resignation.
There comes a moment in public life where your principles are really important. And my principles are around LGBT inclusion. And I feel what the government is doing is trying to create a wedge between LGBT people and trans people. I think it's the wrong approach, and I disagree with the policy.
Were you aware that the government was about to drop its ban on conversion therapy before we broke the story last Thursday?
This came as a complete bolt out of the blue, not just to me, but to the Minister for Women and Equalities, to the LGBT envoy. I was completely shocked.
And you've sat in that room with the powers that be. How would you characterise their approach to trans people?
I think Britain needs a strategy. Government needs a strategy for trans people. I can't see a strategy at the moment. I think, sadly, we have a tabloid debate going on about people's lives. It's not a respectful debate. It's turned into a woke war.
Well, the government says what it's worried about here is unintended consequences of any ban. For example, would you end up stifling genuine discussion between someone who is concerned about their gender identity and a counsellor before they then go through potentially irreversible processes? Other countries, though, have banned this: Canada, France, New Zealand. And tonight, rather than setting an international example, the government is actually having to cancel its international LGBT conference, a key manifesto pledge, because over 100 organisations have withdrawn from that conference, making it completely untenable. And I think really what we're looking at this evening, Tom, is the worst rift between any government and the LGBT community since Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed. Now, it is hard to imagine the pain the family of Stephen Lawrence has been through in the 30 years since his death, of losing him, of knowing that deep, ingrained racism and indeed corruption robbed them of justice over and over again. But there is no doubting the impassioned authority of his brother when he says that the Met must rethink itself once and for all. That, he told Charlene today, can only be done by putting an outsider in charge now that Cressida Dick has gone.
I am a revolutionary. Well done. Give yourself a round of applause, guys. Thank you very much.
I do believe that schools are balanced. It's good to go in there and tell and impart knowledge. There needs to be an environment where they can develop and learn and understand what the world's about and how they fit in and how they can make changes and make the world a better place. After losing Stephen, it was a really hard situation, and I had counselling, I had people reaching out to me. The one thing I wanted at that time was everything to stop. Just for a moment. And that's the one thing that never does happen.
When your family had the justice that they had been seeking, do you feel like at that point, perhaps you were able to grieve?
It's only partly done, isn't it?
Yeah.
We never get the point where you go, that you can close that. There's more unanswered questions. There's more like, well, why? There's more, which if you allow yourself to fester and to go in that direction, then again, that's part of your life taken up doing something.
Where do you stand then regarding the Metropolitan Police?
Some of the things that we've been hearing about recently are hereditary things. It takes such a long for a process of...
It's like 30 years ago.
I know.
30 years ago.
I know.
Down the road from my local cinema. This is longer than a generation later.
I know.
Are you still hopeful? Have you ever been hopeful?
I went to school the next day after Stephen died. I got the names. I came home. My parents gave them to the police. We found out in 2011 that someone phoned up the hotline, left the names. Someone had walked into the police station, gave the names. So if that was 30 years ago, and that was the current mood of the general public of wanting to see things, we talked about again, wrong things righted. But then you've got a system that's been put in place to always be unbalanced. It's going to take a politician...
or a new Met Commissioner. You know, they do have to find...
It's more the same, isn't it? It's more the same.
So do you not think it comes from that? At that level?
It's like, why was Sir Clive Woodward, why was a rugby man asked to go into a football camp to make changes?
So do you feel like it needs to be an outsider?
I do. I honestly do. I think it's gonna take someone that can able to have this helicopter approach to look at things and go, do you know what? We're going to make some radical changes.
Stephen Lawrence's brother, Stuart, there, talking to Charlene White. Now, it's axiomatic in political journalism that you tend to overwrite, overread and overanalyse local elections because, of course, for many, they are a chance to punish a national government without actually changing it. But even so, the set due up soon are hard to get a handle on. Are people furious with Partygate or relatively reassured with the government's handling of Ukraine? And what about the cost of living crisis? Which issue is uppermost in voters' minds? And will that tell us anything at all about the run-up to the next general election? To try and find out, and good luck to him, Carl has been to Nuneaton, a council held by Labour for years until the Conservatives took it last time.
Nuneaton and Bedworth used to be fertile territory for Labour. They controlled the council for most of the last 50 years. But that was all overturned with a dramatic Tory victory last year. And Richard, a farmer, will be voting for them again.
I focus on what is our local issues. So our local MP's lobbied hard at Parliament, and he's managed to secure quite a lot of funding to improve our town centre. I think things like that really weigh heavily on my voting.
Do you think so-called Partygate is an issue at all?
To me, it's not that important, but to other people, obviously people that have lost loved ones, it's a big issue when they couldn't visit.
Down the road, donations are arriving for Ukrainian refugees.
We have beddings, we have pushchairs, we have travel cots.
But despite their focus on the war, parties in Downing Street are still on people's minds.
The current government, the trust is gone. The scandals which have come out in the media, and I think that may sway people to change their minds in the way they vote.
I think I will be voting Labour. Partygate has made me quite angry. You know, I've not been able to see my father, who's at death's door.
But at the Nuneaton Bowl, voters aren't thinking about what's happened in Westminster, they're thinking about what happens closer to home.
I'm a single parent, so with 2 children, and it's not easy. I mean, I go to work, I do my best, but at the end of the day, you're always going to be counting the pennies.
Do you think that will influence who you vote for at these elections?
Yeah, definitely.
It's puppy training night at the Coton Sports and Social. Dawn, who runs the club, personifies Nuneaton's changing voting patterns.
I always voted Labour, always, and then at the last election I changed my mind and decided to vote Conservative. Purely and simply, with being a business owner, I felt that they've got better policies.
What's important to you in these elections?
I think the most important thing is how they're going to deal with the rise in prices and the economy, and how they're going to help us still recover from COVID.
Labour do have a chance to catch voters' attention here again, but they need to have something to offer. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Nuneaton.
One of the greatest modern-day England rugby league players was honoured at Windsor Castle today for his contribution to the sport and indeed to the awareness of motor neurone disease. Rob Burrow won numerous honours and trophies in a 17-year career playing for the Leeds Rhinos and England before retiring from the game in 2017. Finally, apart from the seemingly unbreakable spirit of the Ukrainian people in the face of all that they are having to endure, there does seem little room for any optimism at all arising out of this war. But 2 ballerinas, one Ukrainian who fled the war and the other Russian who quit the Bolshoi Ballet because of the war, have sent out their own plea for peace. The pair danced together in a special charity performance last night.
A moment of harmony and hope. Ukrainian dancer Denis Cherevichko and Russian ballerina Maria Yakovleva performing in a ballet for peace. 2 of the famous dancers from both countries on stage in Naples, raising funds for the Red Cross.
Especially right now, it's very important to be both of us and to support and to show to the people that love, peace, art, support and help will save this world.
I love Ukrainian people. We all friends in the ballet world. We're all just dancers.
Among the stars was the former prima ballerina of Moscow's famous Bolshoi Ballet. Olga Smirnova quit last month saying she was against the war with every fibre of her soul.
It's important in this situation, in this time, to be together on stage, to do little thing, the smallest thing what we can do for Ukraine.
Anastasia Guskaya is the Kyiv Opera's principal dancer. She was forced to flee Ukraine because of the fighting.
I've never danced with stars like today, with world stars of ballet, and I'm so excited about it.
The beauty of ballet, a contrast to the brutal images from this war, and a powerful statement of the yearning for peace. Neil Connery, News at 10.
That is all for now on another sobering and frankly distressing day. See you tomorrow. Thank you for watching.
Tomorrow.